Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning from the East Coast of the US. My name is Benjamin Zweig, and I am the Digital Projects Coordinator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And before I begin, I'd just like to extend my thanks and appreciation to everyone at the Belvedere Museum, all the conference organizers, the other speakers for their work in preparing what looks to be a really excellent conference, and in under continually difficult circumstances. I'd especially like to thank Anna Maria Krupova for doing a really extraordinary job of keeping everything on track, which cannot have been easy. So to begin, in the fall of 2018, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. began a long-anticipated project contributing nearly 53,000 high-resolution open access images of its public domain artworks to Wikimedia Commons. As many of you listening might know, Wikimedia Commons is the central media repository for Wikipedia and other Wikimedia platforms. So simply, if you see an image on Wikipedia or in any other site, it's in Wikimedia Commons. It kind of has to be. So the Wikimedia project, was the latest in a series of gallery commitments to open access and making open access a central part of the museum's mission and its identity. This goes back a little ways. Since 2012, the gallery had been freely releasing images of its public domain artworks under its own open access policy, and the images which could be downloaded from a now retired site called NGA Images. Other partnerships, both previously and in the meantime, included Art Store, unsurprisingly, or those that formed after 2012, such as the gallery's partnership with the Google Arts and Culture. These projects help to expand open access initiatives and the gallery's online reach. The Wikimedia project, however, was a major advance in the gallery's open access initiatives, both in terms of reaching audiences across the world and in enabling the use of the museum's images. Its goal was to increase the accessibility of the collection and increase viewership by effectively going to where the audience already was. Now today, just briefly, I'd like to discuss a few of these issues, as well as some observations that we've gleaned over the past year and a half or so now that this project has really taken off. So just a brief picture on the overall kind of state of the project. So as mentioned, it was initiated in the fall of 2018. And by September the following year, 2019, we had successfully contributed all 53,000 images that had been prepared and uploaded to Wikimedia Commons. But the project, that was the initial state of the project. But during the kind of work, the initial groundwork, we actually expanded it. During the planning phase, we consulted with the Wikimedia GLAM outreach community, GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. I know everybody watching that knows that, but I just want to be sure. So the GLAM outreach team, who informed us of a then in the works project called Structured Data on Commons, which leveraged structured data pulled from Wikidata, the kind of Wikimedia Foundation linked data knowledge base, which I think many might be familiar with, and which was the museum's first attempt at an open data program until its open data release new program in 2021. So during the project, the early phases, we then expanded it to include donating 120,000 art object collection records, basic tombstone data of artist title, date, and so on, from the permanent collection to Wikidata. And by February of 2020, we had concluded the contribution with all the images and data on Wikimedia Commons and Wikidata available and available freely, unrestricted under a Creative Commons 0 license. And just a quick example here, you'll see on the left, what many might be familiar with, the kind of typical file that you'll find on Wikimedia Commons, and this is one of the gallery's images. And then on the right is an example of a gallery contributed collection record on Wikidata. And you can see there's a lot of overlap in terms of interface and structure because it's the interoperability of Wikimedia. So the goal of the project, as I stated, was really to increase viewership initially. And this has been quite successful. As of today, the gallery's images on Wikimedia projects generate around 7 million views per month and in over 60 different languages. And this is just an example of one of the Wikimedia analytics tools where we can see view numbers as well as the kind of places some of the gallery's images show up. The timing of the completion of the project was, if not fortuitous, certainly interesting. So as of February 2020, the next month in March, the gallery, along with the rest of the world, shut down due to the pandemic. As such, what was once perhaps thought of as an extension of the museum, as a kind of addition, digital images, the presence of the website, interaction, virtual tours, and so forth, gave way to effectively, in the midst of the pandemic, becoming the museum itself. As the actual objects were siloed away from the world, digital images were not only extended representations of the collection, but they became surrogates for the institution. Thus, the museum's website and its partnerships, such as ArtStore, Google, and now Wikimedia, became the avenues through which visitors could interact with the gallery's artworks. In the face of what looked to be indefinite closure, their centrality to the museum's mission became ever more apparent. They kept the metaphorical lights on. Yet this newfound centrality also highlighted limitations that might not have been as apparent when the physical location was open. For example, partnerships like ArtStore, depending on it, requires a subscription. Many people don't have that. Google requires knowledge of the platform, and many of its experiences in some ways are effectively predetermined by what Google has decided is interesting. And sometimes I think the allure of what Google does is actually in the experience of the technology itself rather than in the artwork. To be clear, this is neither good nor bad in and of itself, but it brings into sharper focus how and why the gallery's Wikimedia partnership is different, especially as the digital has taken on more centrality for the museum experience and identity over the last 2 years. As many of you might know, in recent years, Wikimedia Commons, the Wikimedia Foundation, and the Wikimedia community has become a growing platform and a base of non-traditional partners for art museums, with notable projects occurring and being undertaken by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, the Cleveland Museum of Art, amongst many others. So what then actually makes Wikimedia different and its relationship to an art museum? The first thing to note that makes it different, kind of very quickly and understandably so, is that once an image is on Wikimedia Commons or is on Wikidata, it is effectively untethered from the strictures of the museum. It becomes a block, an immediately usable resource for an already established and yet ever-growing community of people who will use it. That is, It is placed within an ecosystem in which anyone can do things with it. And as such, everyone can see what everyone else does with it. Basically, just yours and everyone's. So some of what you can do, engagement and experience of object within Wikimedia, kind of mirrors what can be done on the gallery's own website and many other museum websites. For example, from Wikimedia, you can download a local copy of the image to use as you wish. You can explore an artwork in great detail and up close using the zoom tools. These are expected experiences and very much oriented towards an individualized engagement with or experience of the artwork. And this just here is an example of using the Wikimedia zoom tool, which is pretty good. And to kind of foster this slightly replicated experience of the museum, we contributed all of our images at a high resolution publishable quality to ensure that this kind of duplicate or repeated experience similar to the museum website would occur. And I should also mention briefly, because something that comes up with Wikimedia projects occasionally is the smallness of images. So all the ones that we gave were actually not only large, but captured directly from the objects. So it's a fairly direct engagement. There's no kind of scan mediation. So, but then in the Wikimedia sphere, aside from doing this, or rather, you can engage with this, but there's something else. And within the Wikimedia sphere, and here's perhaps a key difference, one can immediately transform an engagement or just an interest into a contribution in itself that feeds back into the site. It's an iterative process that affects others and affects how they see the gallery's artworks, reused and remixed. So here now, I'd just like to draw attention to a couple examples of what we've seen over the past year or so and how people are using our objects. So the first example deals with categories. And again, for those who are familiar with Wikimedia and Wikimedia projects, you'll understand the importance of this. For those who don't, let me just describe it briefly. So categories are the basic organizing structure of Wikimedia Commons. An image, all images effectively have to be attached to categories. An image can fall into one or many. These can be expected ones, such as by artist, location, subject matter. In the gallery's case, what we see in Wikimedia, users have created numerous categories and subcategories for the museum's open access images, for example, those based on artist or material or genre. And here you see a couple just examples, screenshots of kind of how the Wikimedia community has taken our materials once we put it out there and started to reorganize things in a way that makes them discoverable. An artist on the left from something called the Index of American Design, portrait engravings, and you can see how people are kind of restructuring our objects on Wikimedia. So those are kind of typical or expected ones, but they can also be less expected, more idiosyncratic. Adding images to categories not directly related to the museum, and sometimes very barely related to the artwork itself. So they can bring the gallery's artworks into dialogue not only with other artworks, but also through concepts, sometimes in quite interesting and entertaining ways. For instance, one of the gallery's images, which is this one, again from this project called the Index of American Design, which is a project during the 1930s and 40s from the Works Progress Administration. It's a 1939 watercolor of a beer bottle. But a Wikimedia user has decided to take this image and has connected it not to other artworks, but to the history of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to the culture of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and to 1939 in art. So it's interesting to see these kind of more interesting unexpected examples. A second example is that Wikimedias have been using, or that we've seen them use, is derivative images or connected images centered around a singular artwork that often modifies and hopefully enhances the artwork itself. For example, the gallery in its collection has an original page of Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland from 1906. In this case, for this file and record, a Wikimedia user has actually added the published color version to this file as an other version, which is a feature Wikimedia allows for, multiple images for a single file. So again, this is now without the galleries pushing. This is kind of purely organic interest from users who are discovering our collections and deciding to do something with them. Some other examples that are similar to this that I won't go into too much, but include linking a file to its respective entity on Wikidata, or pulling in data from there, or creating derivatives, crops and extracts that also then become available on the platform. A third example of what we've seen, and which the Wikimedia Foundation really supports, is description. As mentioned earlier, Wikimedia Commons now supports what's called structured data on commons. And what this does is it allows users to add structured, machine-readable descriptive text to all the image files on Wikimedia Commons, so it makes it both easier for humans and especially machines and programs to be able to read them. So now many of the gallery's images are actually receiving machine-readable descriptions supplied by Wikimedia users that are actually connected to Wikidata. And this is often being used for subject matter. And here you just see an example of one of the gallery's most famous works by Vermeer, and kind of how this data, the structured data, looks on a Wikimedia file. A fourth instance that we've seen with Wikimedia community is simply building things. Which is quite interesting, and this is especially true from Wikidata. So the Wikimedia community continues to use the gallery's images, and especially now its data, to build out what are multi-year endeavors, such as this project, which some of you might be familiar with, which is called the Sum of All Paintings, an ambitious project which does what it says it does, or tries to, which is to kind of become a complete repository and record of paintings around the world. So it's very ambitious and quite long-standing. In addition to this, Wikidata has a Sparkle endpoint query service. I don't want to go into that too much today, but it allows for the querying and building of tools and other outcomes, maps, visualizations, using both the gallery's data and whatever else might be useful within Wikidata. Finally, I've left actually the most obvious example to last, and that is simply Wikimedia users in the community adding the gallery's images to Wikipedia entries. This is the most visible use of the gallery's materials, as well as its most impactful. For example, one of the most frequently viewed images of the gallery artwork is this Gilbert Stewart portrait of John Adams. This image generates roughly around 600,000 views per month. And the reason is the image started out being just on one English language Wikimedia page, but the community has expanded it, and it now appears on over 20 English entries, as well as in other language entries in Spanish, Hungarian, Galician, Japanese, Korean, Indonesian, Dutch, Romanian, Serbian, Turkish, and Vietnamese. It is also used on a variety of entries that actually relate to the figure of John Adams, such as on the history of presidential inaugurations, international treaties, the Federalist Party, and even how Adams is referenced in poet Ezra Pound's cantos, which you see at the bottom right. And just to give you a real sense of the impact of this and the impact of this kind of work, in December the John Adams image had 624,000 views on Wikimedia projects, and the same image on the gallery's website had 65. And that's not 65,000, that's just 65 views. And this is where it really kind of comes into its own, because many of the most viewed gallery images are on pages that deal with themes or historical events for which an artwork might have relevance. For example, Boucher's Allegory of Music from 1764, Jose Posada's print on the Mexican Revolution, and Camille Pissarro's painting on the 1807 invasion of the Danish West Indies. And here's a quick example of kind of more multi-language use, where we have gallery images on entries in both Thai and Chinese. And I think my time is almost up, so I'm going to wrap up, which is good because I'm just there. So what I've been describing is how the community continues to use the gallery's images on Wikimedia, and now how it's become a major avenue for the gallery's collection and how it reaches a large audience. What ends up happening now, though, is that the gallery's collection is mediated and transformed by what others do to them. And the extended experience of the gallery's collection changes in ways that could not have been initiated by the museum itself. It's become an important feature of the gallery's digital presence, as it has for other museums. But as alluded to, doing this kind of work is different than, say, the important work of building experiences on its own website, for it goes to where an audience already is, as well as a space where people can do things directly with the collection. I think one interesting aspect of Wikimedia is that it does not try to recreate the museum experience at all. It does the opposite. Its most salient feature is in dispersion, which supports both more usage and more serendipitous engagement with the image and the museum itself. But of course, none of this can actually happen without the institutional commitment to openness and open access. It requires a commitment of the museum to include this kind of work as part of its identity as a museum in the digital age. For I think to be an art museum now in the digital age, one of the imperatives is, perhaps, to be not in a museum at all, but elsewhere. Thank you.